I never thought I'd see that photo again. Hell, I didn't even know it existed. But when Owen's grandson sent me that message on Facebook with the attachment, my hands actually shook as I clicked to open it. There we were, two young soldiers in our early 20s standing outside some dingy bar in Ida, Seoul, smiling like idiots with our arms slung around each other's shoulders. The edges were worn soft from decades of being folded and unfolded, carried in a wallet through what I can only imagine was an entire lifetime. Owen had kept it all these years, 43 years to be exact. The message from his grandson Kyle was simple. My grandfather passed away last week. When we were going through his things, we found this photo in his wallet. You're in it. He talked about you sometimes, about Korea. I thought you'd want to know he's gone. I thought you'd want to see this. I sat there in my home office staring at that picture for I don't know how long. My husband Marcus eventually came in and found me just frozen, tears running down my face, looking at these two kids who had no idea what their lives would become. Marcus didn't say anything. He just put his hand on my shoulder and waited. That's one of the things I love most about him. He knows when to wait. I met Owen Chen in 1981 at Camp Casey in South Korea. I was 22, fresh out of basic training, absolutely terrified that someone would figure out I was gay, and doing everything I could to blend in. The Army back then wasn't just, don't ask, don't tell. It was hunt down and destroy. I'd heard stories about guys getting beaten up, dishonorably discharged, their lives ruined. So I kept my head down, did my job, and tried not to look at anyone too long. Owen arrived 3 months after I did. I remember the first time I saw him in the barracks. He had this quiet confidence about him, like he knew exactly who he was and didn't need anyone's approval. He was assigned to the bunk next to mine, and within a week, we'd fallen into this easy friendship that felt as natural as breathing. We'd grab meals together, work out together, pull duty shifts together. He was funny in this dry, unexpected way. He'd say something completely deadpan, and I'd be doubled over laughing while everyone else was still trying to figure out if he was joking. About 2 months in, we were on weekend leave wandering around Seoul. It was late, we'd had a few beers, and we ended up sitting on the steps of some random apartment building watching taxis go by. I don't remember what we were talking about. Something stupid, probably. But then Owen went quiet for a minute and said, "Can I tell you something? And you promise not to freak out?" My heart started pounding. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. I could feel it. "I'm gay," he said, not looking at me, just staring straight ahead at the street. "I know that's probably weird to hear. I know we're friends and you might not want to be anymore. But I feel like I can trust you and I'm tired of pretending every second of every day." I couldn't breathe. I literally couldn't make my lungs work. Here was this moment I'd been terrified of since I joined up. But it wasn't about me. It was Owen trusting me with the most dangerous secret a soldier could have. "I'm not going to freak out," I finally managed to say. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. "I'm gay too." The look on his face. I'll never forget it. This mixture of relief and disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite name. He laughed, this short burst of sound that was almost a sob. "Are you serious?" he asked. "You're not just saying that to make me feel better?" "I'm serious," I said. "I've never told anyone before. Not anyone." We sat there for a while longer, not saying much, but everything had changed. It was like we could finally breathe around each other. We weren't alone anymore. In that entire massive military machine designed to crush people like us, we'd somehow found each other. After that night, we became inseparable. Not in an obvious way. We were careful. But we'd find reasons to be together, to get away from base, to have these pockets of time where we could just be ourselves. We'd go to this tiny restaurant in Uijeongbu where the owner didn't speak English, and we could sit in the back corner and talk about everything. Our families, our fears, what we thought our lives might look like if we could ever just be honest about who we were. Owen wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to write, maybe work in journalism. We'd spin these elaborate fantasies about living in San Francisco or New York, places where we'd heard gay people could actually exist without constantly looking over their shoulders. I fell in love with him somewhere in there. I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was the night he brought me soup when I had food poisoning and sat on the floor next to my bunk reading to me from this terrible sci-fi novel he'd found in the day room. Maybe it was the time we were on a training exercise and got separated from our unit in the mountains, and he kept making jokes to keep me from panicking until we found our way back. Maybe it was just the accumulation of 1,000 small moments when I'd look at him and think, this is the person I want to know for the rest of my life. We never talked about it being love. We couldn't. It was too dangerous, too impossible. We were soldiers in the U.S. Army in 1982. We had 9 months left on our deployment. The plan was to survive, get home, and then maybe figure out if there was a way to stay in each other's lives. We were so careful. We never touched beyond the normal buddy stuff. We never said anything that could be misinterpreted. We protected each other by protecting the secret. But then there was this one night. We'd gone into Seoul to eat one, just walking around. Some guy outside a bar offered to take our picture, and we said, sure. Why not? We stood there with our arms around each other like any two friends would, smiling at the camera. The guy took the shot with Owen's camera and handed it back. We didn't think anything of it, just a normal picture of two normal soldiers on a normal night. Except when we got back to base and Owen got the film developed, something about that picture was different. I don't know if it was the way we were looking at each other or something in our expressions, but when he showed it to me, we both saw it. We looked happy, really happy. We looked like two people who meant something to each other. It was dangerous to have evidence like that, but Owen kept the photo anyway. He said it was the only picture he had where he looked like himself. 3 weeks later, everything fell apart. There was another soldier in our unit, a guy named Patterson who'd been making comments for a while. Little homophobic jokes, watching people too closely, like he was on some kind of mission to root out anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of what a soldier should be. Owen and I had been careful around him, but apparently not careful enough. I still don't know exactly what Patterson saw or thought he saw. Maybe we stood too close one time. Maybe our friendship itself was suspicious to him, but he started making accusations. He went to our commanding officer and said he had concerns about unit cohesion. That's what they called it. Concerns about unit cohesion. What he meant was he thought Owen and I were gay, and he wanted us investigated. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare. We were questioned separately. Our barracks were searched. Other soldiers were interviewed about us. Owen and I barely saw each other during that time, and when we did, we couldn't talk. We just had to pretend we were casual acquaintances who happened to be going through the same horrible experience. I was so scared. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything I'd lose, my career, my family's respect, any chance at a normal future. And I was terrified for Owen too, maybe even more than I was for myself. I kept thinking, if they discharge him, if they ruin his life because of me, because we were friends, I'll never forgive myself. But somehow, miraculously, there wasn't enough evidence. We'd been too careful. No one had seen anything definitive. No one could prove anything. After 2 weeks of investigation, they dropped it with a warning about maintaining proper military bearing and avoiding situations that could be misinterpreted. We were split up. Owen was transferred to a different unit on the other side of the base. We were told to limit our contact. We managed to meet one more time before the transfer went through. We snuck away during a shift change and met behind the motor pool. We had maybe 10 minutes. Owen looked exhausted. I probably looked worse. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry this happened." "It's not your fault," he said. "Patterson's a bastard. We didn't do anything wrong." "I know, but..." I didn't know how to finish that sentence. I wanted to tell him I loved him. I wanted to tell him that the last few months had been the best of my life despite everything. I wanted to tell him I didn't know how I was going to get through the rest of this deployment without him. But all I could say was, "I'm going to miss you." "I'm going to miss you too," he said. Then he pulled something out of his pocket. It was that photo from Itaewon, the one where we looked so happy. He'd cut it in half down the middle, right between us. He handed me one half. "So we both have proof this was real," he said, "so we don't forget." I took my half of the photo and put it in my wallet. We stood there for another minute, not touching, not saying anything, and then Owen turned and walked away. I watched him go and felt something break inside my chest. We wrote to each other a few times after that. Careful letters that could have been between any two friends. But after I rotated back to the States and Owen extended his tour for another year, the letters got less frequent and then stopped. I didn't know how to find him. This was before the internet, before social media. He'd mentioned once that his family was from Sacramento, but I didn't have an address. Unseen. I told myself I'd track him down eventually, but months turned into years and life got complicated. I moved to Chicago. I worked as a copywriter for an advertising agency. I came out to my family in 1987. It went badly. My parents didn't speak to me for 3 years. I threw myself into work, into the gay community I'd finally found, into therapy to deal with all the trauma I'd been carrying. I dated a little, but nothing serious. I kept that half photo in my wallet, though. Through everything, through all the years and all the changes, I kept it. Sometimes I'd take it out and look at it and wonder where Owen was, what his life had turned out like, if he ever thought about me. I met Marcus in 1994 at a friend's dinner party. He was a high school English teacher, smart and kind and patient with all my baggage. We dated for 2 years before moving in together. He knew about Owen. I'd told him early on that there'd been someone once, someone important, but that I'd lost touch with him. Marcus never seemed jealous or threatened by it. He understood that you can love the person you're with while still carrying tenderness for someone from your past. Marcus and I got married in 2013, as soon as it became legal in Illinois. By then, I'd been working as a freelance journalist for years, writing mostly about LGBTQ issues and military policy. Don't Ask, Don't Tell had been repealed in 2011, and I'd written several pieces about what that policy had cost people of my generation. The lives destroyed, the careers ended, the fear we'd lived with. Sometimes, when I was working on those articles, I'd think about Owen and wonder if he'd made it through okay, if he'd found happiness, if he'd found love. I thought about trying to find him over the years. I really did. But something always stopped me. Fear, maybe. Fear that he wouldn't remember me the same way I remembered him. Fear that he'd moved on completely and I'd just be an uncomfortable reminder of a difficult time. Fear that he'd had a hard life and I'd feel guilty for not being there. Or maybe fear that he'd had a wonderful life and hadn't needed me at all. So I just carried that half photo and wondered. And then last Tuesday, I got Kyle's message. Owen was gone. He'd died of a heart attack at 71. He'd lived in Portland. He'd been a middle school English teacher for 30 years. He'd never married. He'd come out to his family in the late 90s and they'd been supportive. He'd had a good life, according to Kyle. A quiet life, but a good one. And he'd kept that photo in his wallet for 43 years. Kyle said his grandfather had mentioned me a handful of times over the years, always just in passing. I knew a guy named Adrian once in Korea. We were good friends. Kyle said he'd found a box of old letters in Owen's apartment, including a few I'd sent back in 82 and 83. He said Owen had never really talked about being in love with anyone, but Kyle had a feeling, going through his grandfather's things, that maybe I'd been important in a way Owen had never fully explained. I wrote back to Kyle and told him yes, we'd been important to each other. I told him about Korea, about the friendship, about how his grandfather had been one of the bravest people I'd ever known. I didn't tell him we'd been in love. I wasn't sure if that was my story to tell. But I told him Owen had mattered to me, that I'd thought about him often over the years, and that I was sorry I'd never reached out. Kyle wrote back and said there was going to be a memorial service in Portland that weekend. He said I was welcome to come if I wanted. He said he thought his grandfather would have liked that. I talked to Marcus about it that night. We were in bed, and I was still holding my phone, still looking at that photo of 2 young soldiers who had no idea what was coming. I think I need to go, I said. I think I need to say goodbye. Of course you do, Marcus said. I'll come with you if you want, or you can go alone if you need to. Come with me, I said. I want you there. So we flew to Portland on Friday. The memorial service was on Saturday afternoon at a community center near where Owen had lived. There were maybe 50 people there. Former students, colleagues from the school where he'd taught, neighbors, his family. Kyle spotted me when we walked in and came over to introduce himself. He was in his late 20s, tall like Owen had been, with the same quiet manner. Thank you for coming, he said, shaking my hand. It means a lot. I know my grandfather would be happy you're here. Then he handed me something. It was the other half of the photo, Owen's half. "I think you should have this," Kyle said, "to complete the set." I stood there holding both halves of that picture, and I started crying right there in the entrance of the community center. Marcus put his arm around me, and Kyle looked a little alarmed, like maybe he'd made a mistake. But I managed to tell him thank you, that this meant everything, that his grandfather had been one of the most important people in my life. The service was beautiful. Person after person got up and talked about Owen, how patient he'd been as a teacher, how he'd had this way of making every student feel seen and valued, how he'd volunteered with LGBTQ youth organizations, how he'd been quietly, steadily kind to everyone he met. I sat there listening and thinking about the young man I'd known and how he'd grown into exactly the person he'd wanted to be. He'd made it. Despite everything, despite the fear and the danger and the way the world had been back then, he'd made it to the other side and built a life that mattered. At the reception after the service, I talked to some of Owen's former students. One of them, a woman probably in her 40s now, told me that Mr. Chen had been the first teacher who'd made her feel okay about being gay, that he'd never made a big deal about it, but she'd known somehow that he understood, that he'd been through it too. She said he'd probably saved her life just by being present and visible and kind. I thought about telling Kyle the whole truth before Marcus and I left Portland. I thought about explaining that Owen and I hadn't just been friends, that we'd been in love in the way that young people are when they first find someone who sees them completely. But in the end, I didn't. Some things are private. Some things are sacred. Kyle knew his grandfather had cared about me. That was enough. On the flight home, I sat with those two halves of the photo in my hands. Marcus had borrowed some tape from the flight attendant, and I carefully joined them back together. There we were, whole again. Two young soldiers with their arms around each other, smiling like they had all the time in the world. I thought about Owen carrying his half for 43 years. Through his whole life, through everything he experienced and everyone he met, he'd kept that piece of paper in his wallet. He'd kept me with him. I don't know what that means exactly. Maybe it means he loved me the way I loved him. Maybe it means I represented something important to him, a time when he'd been brave enough to be honest with someone. Maybe it just means he valued what we'd had, that friendship or love or whatever you want to call it, and wanted to remember. What I do know is this. We find each other in the strangest places, in the middle of fear and danger and systems designed to keep us apart. We somehow find each other, and those connections matter. They shape us. They carry us through. Owen carried me in his wallet for 43 years, and I carried him in my heart. We never got to have the life together that we might have wanted back when we were 22, and everything seemed impossible. But we had something. We had those months in Korea. We had that friendship. We had the knowledge that we'd been seen and known by someone else. I have the complete photo now, taped back together, sitting on my desk in a frame. Marcus sees me looking at it sometimes, and he understands. He knows that loving him doesn't erase what I felt for Owen, that the heart is big enough to hold multiple truths, that you can grieve for a road not taken while still being grateful for the road you're on. Sometimes I think about what I'd say to Owen if I could talk to him one more time. I'd tell him I'm sorry we lost touch. I'd tell him I thought about him more than he probably knew. I'd tell him I'm glad he became a teacher, that he helped all those kids, that he built a life that mattered. I'd tell him thank you for being brave enough to trust me with the truth that night in Seoul. I'd tell him that knowing him changed my life. But mostly, I think I'd just tell him I loved him. I loved him then, and I love him now, and I'll carry him with me for whatever years I have left. Just like he carried me, in wallets and hearts and memories that refuse to fade no matter how much time passes. That photo is proof that we existed together, that for a brief moment in history, two scared young men found each other and held on as tight as they could. We didn't get forever, but we got something real. And Owen kept it safe all these years, folded in his wallet, close to his heart. That has to mean something. That has to count. I'm grateful Kyle sent me that message. I'm grateful I got to say goodbye, even if Owen wasn't there to hear it. I'm grateful I know how his story ended, that it was a good life, a meaningful life. And I'm grateful for Marcus, who understands that the heart's capacity for love isn't limited, that honoring one person doesn't diminish what you feel for another. The photo sits on my desk now, those two young soldiers smiling at the camera, whole again after 43 years apart. Sometimes I look at it and feel sad for everything we didn't get to have. But mostly, I look at it and feel grateful for what we did have, for finding each other in an impossible place, for being brave enough to be honest, for those months of friendship and love and understanding that got us both through. Owen Chen kept my picture in his wallet for 43 years. And now I know. Now I finally know that I mattered to him the way he mattered to me. That's enough. It has to be enough, because it's all we get sometimes, these small proofs of love, these photographs and memories and moments of grace that carry us through our lives. I'm 65 years old now. Owen's gone. But that photo remains. Evidence of something real and true and worth remembering. Two young men who found each other in the darkness and held on tight, who loved each other in the only way they could, who carried each other forward into lives they built piece by careful piece. Thank you, Owen, for trusting me, for being my friend, for keeping that picture all these years, for being proof that love survives even when the world tells us it shouldn't exist. You mattered. You matter still. And I'll carry you with me, just like you carried me, until the very end. Total char count, 16,847.